Grüß, willkommen in einem anderen Aufregens video, or welcome to yet another exciting video, in this case part 19 of my battle series. In this case I'll be investigating the Austrian army in 1805 during the War of the Third Coalition. This video will be focused on the organisation of the Austrian army during the first part of the war. I'll be not covering any specific battles in detail, nor will I be covering the French troop types or other factors not specifically involving the position and organisation of the various Austrian formations during the beginning period of the war, or at least until around about the end of October. As a result, I'm not going to be covering Austerlitz or any of the latter battles. It'll be mainly the beginning. And the reason for that was that while creating generic army lists for a card-based TO&E system for the 1805 campaign, I had a real issue with the Austrians. Because the Austrians surrendered a large part of their army at Ulm rather than fight and lose a major battle, it was difficult to find TO&Es for the various corps-size formations which I needed for my cards. There were a number of smaller battles, such as the Battle of Wertingen and the Battle of Haslach-Jungen, but there was no battle involving the bulk of either side. And without a major battle, no one was going to create a TO&E for me to copy. If you are creating a specific scenario of a specific battle, then there's no need to know about the forces which surrendered at Ulm because there was no battle. However, if you wanted to investigate the campaign as a whole, which ended with a surrender at Ulm, then you don't have a single large decisive battle which would have generally resulted in detailed TO&Es. This campaign consisted of a great deal of confusing, manoeuvring, units swapping around, and a number of smaller battles. So it's very difficult to ascertain exactly where the formations went during the campaign because of a lack of sources. On a traditional figure gaming playing area, that kind of campaign is difficult to do simply because most figure gaming rules can't support a campaign which covered such an enormous span of area. However, if you did have a set of rules which allowed you to duplicate that campaign, how could you do it without detailed TO&Es? What I want to do is create a TO&E for the campaign, the whole campaign, and I do use a set of rules which allow me to basically have a playing area which can span an enormous area. So I can do it, but how do I actually create a hypothetical 1805 scenario? Because in order to do so, I need to know where the formations were, when, and how they were structured. And as we'll discover, there is a real lack of source material that I can use. While there most certainly was military activity which occurred before, the War of the Third Coalition effectively started on the 9th of August when Austria joined the coalition. When Austria joined the war, or entered the war, they decided to make northern Italy the main theatre of operations, with two other armies and a detachment to act as a holding force or a distraction. This shows the position of the Austrian forces on the 25th of September 1805. Let's look at these forces in more detail. The Austrians formed up three main armies. Let's start with the army sent to Bavaria, or to Germany, under the command of Ferdinand, who had Mack as his superior. I had a lot of issues using the sources that I had available to arrive at an idea of the troop numbers at different points in time during the campaign. Niehorster is, as normal, an excellent source, but spelling differences and gaps in the data made it rather hard to work out what I wished to achieve. Some regiments were duplicated, particularly in the latter part in October, so I'm not sure why that was the case. So it made it very difficult to identify where the formations were. This is my best attempt, and I have to admit I am certain it has a reasonable margin of error. The Austrian forces which advanced into Bavaria in early September were divided into 5 columns, shown here. One column, the third, does not have a commander. I'm unsure why that's the case. However, the sources that I'm using from Niehorster are very detailed at this particular point in the war. The next date I'm covering is the 25th of September, and unfortunately I have no TO&Es for this date. All I have is a map which shows the values, which I showed earlier in this video. This shows the positions of the armies between the 2nd and the 25th of September. The main event here was the escape of the Bavarian army and the advance of the Austrian army. On the left you can see the French beginning to form up. This map shows the position from the 26th of September to the 9th of October. The Austrians consolidated their position, but were attacked in the rear by advanced elements of the French. The issue for the Austrians were the French managed to get over the main river obstacles, which they were hoping would basically stop the French from getting into their rear. I do have some TONEs for the 3rd of October, and at the 3rd of October the army was now divided up into 4 corps, of which Wernek's corps was divided into 2 parts on most maps. I'm uncertain of the structure of each part. In addition, reinforcements were arriving from Austria and forces from the Tyrol were moving north to join the main army. This shows the movement between the 7th of October and the 9th of October. As you can see here, the French were right over the main obstacle, river obstacle, and were driving deep across the Austrian line of communication and in between the Austrians and the rapidly arriving Russians. A very bad position for the Austrians. This shows a more detailed view of the position on the 9th of October. As you can see here, Mack was ordering his forces to concentrate at Ulm. There are many reasons why he did that, and I've heard lots of different theories. I'm not really particularly interested in it. Some people blame Mack for the disaster, some people blame, caution on the Austrian part. I don't really know what the answer is, but this is what was occurring, and it was probably the wrong thing to do at this point in time. On this map we can show the positions of the various forces between the 11th and the 14th of October. As you can see here, Napoleon was tightening the noose around the Austrians. This shows a more detailed map of the position on the 14th of October. The Austrians did attempt to escape into different directions, but generally failed. I mean, some forces did get out. The forces which surrendered were certainly not the entire army, but it was certainly a big part of the army. I also possess a TONE for the 23rd of October. However, I only have the structure of a single corps, shown here, and the rest of the army structure is really unknown, so it's all been grouped into a single corps. Now, I'm not sure if that was the case, or if basically when they created the TONE, that's the way they did it. It's like this is still divided, I'm pretty certain this large force was still divided into a number of different pseudo-corps, but the units were being rearranged so regularly it was difficult to really know what was occurring in the single largest corps that you see here. The Austrians did not really have a true formal corps structure in place in 1805. The Battle of Ulm effectively ended on the 19th of October, so I suspect some of these forces include forces which surrendered. As I do not possess manpower values, this is based on the formations present and their normal strength. So I suspect many of the formations were actually at only cadre strength by the end of October. For example, the Austrians lost probably between 30 to 50,000 men by the end of October. So the 122,000 that you see here should really be reduced by between 30 and 50,000 to give you a more accurate view of the true strength of the Austrian army, particularly in this sector. Let's now move to the Second Army. The Second Army was based in Tyrolia and was under the command of Archduke John, the brother of Charles. This was the smallest army, and after it was realised there was no threat in the sector, it probably sent reinforcements up north and south. Or at least I see Tyrolean corps in Ferdinand's army and also in Archduke Charles' army later in October. So I'm assuming these came from Archduke John's force. The army, which was in effect a single corps, at the beginning of September consisted of about 22,000 men. I don't possess any detailed TONEs for this period. I also do not possess any, I don't possess any detailed TONEs of this army in any way, shape or form. All I have is that on the 8th of October about 8,000 line infantry was set up north to assist the Austrians in Bavaria. I have to assume these were part of Archduke John's army. Also, on the 18th of October, a Tyrolean corps under Hiller was supporting the Austrians in Italy. I'm uncertain if this came from the Tyrolean army in October or if it was always with the Italian army. The Tyrolean force here totals 40,000 men, which is a lot more than the 22,000 that I indicated earlier, but possibly could include all the forces mobilised in Tyrolia. I suspect part of this was sent down at the beginning of the war, thus the 22,000 that was there at the beginning of the war does not include this corps. As I indicated before, it's very hard to pin down where the formations were at any particular point in time. I do have a TONE for the 23rd of October, and on this date the Tyrolean army consisted of 22,000 men, which is a similar strength of the forces at the beginning of September. It's difficult to pin down the actual movement of forces, but I suspect forces from this army was sent north, particularly, maybe south, that's a question mark, and to replace those forces, new formations arrived as reinforcements, ensuring the army always remained about 22,000 manpower size, or men in strength. Let's now look at the final army, which is the Italian army under Charles. Initially, this was the largest force. While Mack was being surrounded up north, the army in Italy, the Austrians engaged in a slow retreat, with the pivotal battle being the Battle of Caldiero on the 30th of October, where the Austrians were defeated. Look, I'm a bit uncertain why Archduke Charles retreated. I suspect the reason why he did that was because he realised the main French attack was actually occurring up north, and he better pull back to assist the northern forces, which were under strength compared to Archduke Charles. That's my guess. If that's not the case, then considering the Austrians outnumbered the French significantly, their performance was not stellar in any way, shape or form. While this map covers a period that's not covered in the video, because I'm only really covering up until the end of October, it does show the situation in November, December, and gives you an idea of what the Austrians were up to. This saw Charles engage in a strategic retreat. I have to assume his brother and Hilia did so as well. This Russian language map provides a better view of the situation, showing how all three forces retreated and joined in the rear. On the 18th of October, the Army of Italy was divided into three corps or wings, with a garrison force in the rear and a further corps north, which is Hilia's corps. I do have a TONE for the army on the 23rd of October, but it doesn't break it down by corps, it just simply groups them all together. So this shows the combined army under Charles, which theoretically totaled 114,000 men. However, once again, this is derived from the formations and assumes no losses. The actual number would have been less, as we know that at least 5,000 men surrendered in a single minor battle shortly before this particular date. So I suspect the number was closer to 100,000, if not lower. So, in conclusion, even if Mack did not get himself surrounded, his forces were simply inadequate to face up to 200,000 French soldiers. Even if he withdrew and joined up with the Russians, Napoleon would have still had a numeric superiority. I suspect it would have been an interesting battle if it did occur, but there were many examples of Austrian caution, which would have meant that the Austrians or the coalition would have never been involved in an attack, but that doesn't mean that they would not have been able to perform reasonably well in a defence. So it would have been interesting to see if it was a more normal battle. But as it was, Napoleon's genius and, let's say, Mack's mistakes resulted in not a bloodless victory, but a very low-cost victory for Napoleon. Let's now look at the corps structure in more detail, starting with the 5 columns of the Army of Germany or Bavaria. The structure seems unusually uniform, with some minor variations. 2 cavalry regiments and 3 infantry regiments seem to be the basic structure of each column. The artillery numbers seem unusually low. I suspect there was a lot of regimental guns scattered around the infantry, with 2 batteries at column level. These tended to be then distributed among the infantry when in action. The sources I primarily use here is Niehoster. I will include a link to all the sources that I used in this video in the description here, but this just shows the first source, which I used to create the column breakdown, which is titled Austrian Army in Bavaria, September 1805. By the 8th of October, the Army of Bavaria was organised into 4 corps, with 1 corps split, making 5 manoeuvre units. I suspect each corps had at least 2 artillery batteries, as well as regimental guns scattered around the infantry. Instead of concentrating their heavy cavalry, the Austrians scattered these powerful formations around the divisions. The Austrians also scattered their artillery around. This was a suboptimal deployment of these troop types, although I must admit it was common prior to 1805. That organisation was once again taken from sources from Niehorster, and the title of the source that I used was The Austrian Army in Bavaria, 8th of October 1805. There are other sources that I have for the later periods from Niehorster, but these lack any core structures. So I'm not going to display them here because the objective here was to look at the corps. So let's move on to the next army, where I do have some structures below the army and higher than division or brigade. This shows the Army of Italy. Now, one of the divisions in one of the corps was not with the main army, and so I've not included it here. The same also applies to garrison forces and also a detached Tyrolean corps. This army was organised into wings rather than the pseudo-corps which Niehorster seemed to indicate the Army of Bavaria was organised in, at least in October. The wing sizes are rather large for a corps, but probably are typical for the old wing structure. As with the Army of Germany, a lot of the cavalry was distributed across the infantry divisions rather than being concentrated. The Niehorster source I used was titled The Austrian Army of Italy, 18th October 1805. While I have to admit the Army of 1805 did implement a number of reforms, unfortunately, because it was meeting a French army which had been completely reorganised to meet Napoleon's vision of the way armies should be organised, did not fare very well. Basically, the French army was the state of the art in 1805 and was far superior than pretty much any other army around. So the Austrians were always going to have difficulty trying to match that. With the structures that the Austrians implemented compared to the French, the Austrians were always going to have an issue at the strategic or even operational level. At a tactical level, the individual formations were certainly adequate, or should have been adequate, although one source that I did read indicated the change to the infantry battalions, which Mack implemented, that is the reduction in number of companies, was done so quickly the infantry was not trained up to operate in their new structure. Now, if this was correct, then this could explain why the Austrians seemed to perform so poorly against the French, even when they outnumbered the French. And so we come to an end of my part 19 of my battle video series, in this case covering the Austrian army during the early period of the War of the Third Coalition in 1805. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.